Alrighty, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you happen to be looking at this. We are plodding right along. We only have 4 chapters left. Woo-hoo! Alright, so this is chapter 28, Uncivil Wars, so our liberal crisis and conservative rebirth. Alrighty. So, you've seen the Uncle Sam poster where he wants you to join the army, he wants you to do this, he wants you to do this. This is propaganda during the Vietnam War. Basically, people saying, we want out. You have a big counterculture that's occurring, youth mainly doing things like sewing the American flag on the seat of their pants as an attack on America and American values. This is all about America that's being damaged by war. Alrighty, so let's start with JFK. He embodied expectations and inspiration for many Americans. He was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas, Texas. The Kennedy mystique developed from JFK's youthful image and his assassination. So he's young and he's good looking. Reality of his life, he's a womanizer in poor health. He was masked by the promise that his image portrayed to the nation, and then it was destroyed by his death. So he will always be remembered as fantastic and wonderful, but mainly because of his youth and his assassination. And you can see Jackie Kennedy right there, just kind of freaking out. Her husband dies in her arms, and that pink suit had bloodstains all over it. All right. 1964 election. So LBJ comes in after Kennedy is assassinated as the president, and then he runs for his own election in 1964. He runs against Republican Barry Goldwater from Arizona, who's an arch conservative and campaigns against the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and advocates a vigorous Cold War agenda. LBJ wins in a landslide, except for you see where in the South. All right. He's as far as his Great Society goes. This is a program he put together to kind of mimic FDR's New Deal. He successfully broke congressional deadlock on education and healthcare. Elementary and Secondary Education Act gives $1 billion in federal funds for teacher training and education programs. The Higher Education Act provided federal scholarships for college students. He proposed Medicare, which is a health plan for elderly funded by a surcharge on Social Security payroll taxes, and Medicaid, health insurance for the poor. The Great Society's agenda included environmental reform programs. Johnson oversaw the creation of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. He made new investments in urban rapid transit in Washington, D.C. and San Francisco. He helped create the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Passed the Immigration Act of 1965, which eliminates the quota system that favored Northern Europeans. The war on poverty. 1/5 of Americans lived in poverty. LBJ made ending poverty a priority in 1964. The Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 addressed problems of the poor, included several different initiatives: Head Start for nursery schools, Job Corps, and Upward Bound, so job training and employment. Volunteers in Service to America, or VISTA, modeled on the Peace Corps, offered technical assistance to the urban and rural poor. And that's LBJ right there, kind of squatting down. You can see with people that are probably not super wealthy. All right. The Great Society achieved mixed results. The proportion of Americans living below the poverty level dropped from 20% to 13% by 1968. Quality of life and care was improved for the elderly and children. It increased racial diversity. Segregation in urban areas does remain problematic. And the bottom 20% of Americans continue to suffer with little help from programs. So, good and the bad. But a lot of those programs are still in effect to today. All right. Labor feminists. So these are working women who belong to unions. They fought for workplace equality. By 1970, 40% of women were working outside the home. They faced the double day. They were expected to earn a paycheck and then return home to domestic labor. You have Betty Friedan of the National Organization for Women. She creates that. The Indictment of Suburban Domesticity, the Feminine Mystique in 1963 targeted white, middle-class, college-educated women who felt stifled by marriage and family responsibilities. Kennedy appointed the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women in 1961, which publishes a 1963 report on job and education discrimination against women. The word sex was added to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The National Organization for Women, or NOW, was founded in 1966 and was modeled after the NAACP. Membership grows to 15,000 by 1971. So, women fighting for their rights, essentially. Alright, as far as the Vietnam War goes, unfortunately for LBJ, he does a lot of great things, but one of his long-lasting legacies is the fact that he deeply entrenches us into the Vietnam War and really makes a mistake in how he deals with it. So let's start with the Gulf of Tonkin. And the Gulf of Tonkin is, is right here. You can see. Sorry, just getting out of control here. August of 1964, LBJ receives reports that North Vietnamese torpedo boats fired on the U.S. destroyer Maddox. The first attack inflicted a small amount of damage. The second attack proved to be only misread radar sightings. Perceived attack leads to congressional action at the request of LBJ. And you get the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. It gives LBJ the freedom to conduct the war without further congressional approval. Big mistake. But that's what happens. Alright, escalation begins in early 1965 and takes two forms. Deployment of American ground troops. The first Marines waded ashore at Da Nang on March 8, 1965. Intensification of bombing campaign. Operation Rolling Thunder dropped twice as many tons of bombs on Vietnam as the Allies had dropped in both Europe and the Pacific during the whole of World War II. The bombing had only minimal effect on North Vietnam. So, as far as television is concerned, this is one of the first wars that is actually covered on television. Opinion polls supported LBJ in 1965 and 1966. Television coverage shows the war dead and wounded. You get what's called the credibility gap. Journalists begin to question the official version of the war as they witnessed it firsthand in Vietnam, arguing that the administration was hiding bad news. So basically, they're telling us one thing, but we're seeing something else. Financial commitment to the war was increasing the deficit. It was up to $23 billion in 1967. A diverse anti-war movement begins to grow, which was critical of U.S. policy in Vietnam and the goal of an anti-communist South Vietnam. Alright, so college students, they founded Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, at the University of Michigan in 1960. The Port Huron Statement rejected Cold War foreign policy, consumer culture, and the growing disparity between the rich and the poor. New left activists sought to distinguish themselves from communists and socialists of the 1930s and 40s. The free speech movement, fall of 1964 at the University of California at Berkeley, was evidence of students' desire to protest university policies and the actions of politicians in the United States, civil rights, and Vietnam. 1967, the Selective Service System, or the draft, abolished automatic student deferments. It led to increased activism against the war by men of college age. Let's see, our Young Americans for Freedom. They were inspired by the group Young Americans for Freedom. Conservative students asserted their God-given free will and their fear that the federal government accumulates power, which tends to diminish order and liberty. YAF becomes the largest student organization in the United States. It supported U.S. policy in Vietnam, and its founding principles were outlined in the Sharon Statement, 1958. As far as the counterculture goes, many other young Americans embarked on a general revolt against authority and middle-class ideals. Hippies, is what they were called, symbolized the new counterculture. First, initially, the 1960s counterculture celebrated folk music by Pete Singer, Bob Dylan, Joan Baez. Later embraces popular music, the Beatles, and that's a picture of the Beatles right there. And so you look at them, they actually look kind of clean cut, right? They were considered long-haired hippies or long-haired hoodlums, but adults were not fond of them. Recreational drug use increased in the late 60s, marijuana and LSD. In 1967, the world's first human be-in brought 20,000 people to the Golden Gate Park in San Francisco for the Summer of Love. Media coverage made it appear that all American youth were participating, though many did not. If you look at that photo right there in the right, you've got people playing music and people dancing. They appear to be completely lost in the music, perhaps in part because they are using drugs. They are visibly part of the counterculture. And remember, these are the kids that were born during the baby boom. So, large numbers. Okay, back to war. So the Tet Offensive. Death rate for Americans reached several hundred per week by 1968. On January 30th, 1968, Viet Cong launched a massive offensive in South Vietnam, timed to coincide with Tet, the Vietnamese New Year. They focused on 5 major cities, including Saigon. In strictly military terms, the Tet Offensive was a failure, with very heavy losses for the Viet Cong. But psychologically, the effect was damaging for the U.S. as media coverage again hurt LBJ's credibility. Americans began to believe the war was unwinnable, even if they didn't support the peace movement. LBJ does not run for re-election, fearing challengers from his own party. He really basically thinks he's not going to win. He knows he's made a mistake with Vietnam. But in his defense, what he did is kind of been our past experience. You throw enough soldiers and money at it and we will eventually win. Unfortunately, it just didn't work in Vietnam. The year of 1968 is a pretty tragic year, so you have all this going on in Vietnam. You also have the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4th in Memphis, and Robert Kennedy, which is the young man right there, JFK's brother, June 4th in Los Angeles. Oh, and Robert Kennedy likely would have run for president and definitely been more successful than his brother was. So, all right. The Democratic Convention. Divisions within the party took over the convention. There's a siege of Chicago. Activists come to the city seeking to influence the party's platform. They disrupt the convention and or protest the war. Mayor Richard J. Daley orders the police to break up demonstrations. Rioting occurs. Some of it is televised. Richard Nixon, he's northern blue-collar voters, many Catholics, turned to the Republican Party because of the domestic chaos. Nixon sought these voters who feared both communism and the counterculture. And remember, Nixon had run against Kennedy and lost. So people know him. He was Eisenhower's vice president for 8 years. It's not like people don't know who Nixon is. You also have George Wallace, who's governor of Alabama, runs as a third-party candidate and a segregationist. He calls for law and order. And if you look at the map here on the right with the purple, he gets those southern states. As far as Nixon's concerned, Nixon sought to attract Southerners with a more subtle view than Wallace. He promised Southern politicians he would not force civil rights issues. He argued against the anti-war movement and for the quiet voice of the majority of Americans who had been forgotten. He won 43.4% of the vote. You can also notice, just on a side note, how Texas voted. We voted Democrat. So again, not always Republican. All right. The Chicano Moratorium Committee organized demonstrations against the war. They chanted "Viva la Raza," "Afuera Vietnam." Long live the Chicano people, get out of Vietnam. August 1970 attracted 20,000 people to a rally in Los Angeles led by Cesar Chavez. The Black Panthers and the National Black Anti-War Anti-Draft League protested the war. This is Muhammad Ali resisting the draft, and he loses his heavyweight title because of it. Let's see. A new call for women's liberation. So young, college-educated feminists, well-versed in New Left ideology. The terms sexism and male chauvinism become more commonly used. Feminists defined goals: child care, equal pay, abortion rights. African American and Latino women remain on the periphery of white-led women's rights organizations. As far as sexual politics go, campaigning for reproductive rights increases. as did the awareness of sexual assault and harassment in the workplace. Increase in the number of universities that accepted women. You have Title IX in 1972, which is going to prohibit colleges and universities who accepted federal funds from discriminating on the basis of sex. You can't not accept somebody because they are a woman. All right. Inspired by Black Power and women's liberation movements, many men and women came out by identifying themselves as homosexuals. The Greenwich Village, New York bar, the Stonewall Inn, was raided by police in the summer of 1969. Gay and lesbian patrons rioted for 2 days. Gay liberation movement gained momentum. So, I believe you can still go there today. Okay. So Nixon's president. He insists he is going to achieve peace with honor. And he puts together a program called Vietnamization. Brings a decrease in the number of American troops in Vietnam as the responsibility for fighting on the ground shifts to the South Vietnamese. U.S. casualties fell, but the war continues. Anti-war movement intensifies. On April 30th, 1970, you have a U.S. invasion of Cambodia, which is going to result in massive anti-war, massive protests in the United States. May 4th, 1970, at Kent State University in Ohio, National Guardsmen fired into an anti-war rally, wounding 11 students and killing 4. You can actually go there and see the museum, and you can see where they have marked the location of the students' deaths as kind of a memorial to them. The My Lai Massacre, the public learned of this 1968 execution of approximately 500 South Vietnamese by U.S. Army troops. Détente, Nixon sought better relations with the Soviet Union and China. Détente basically kind of means civil agreements or whatever, but when we talk détente, we're talking Nixon and the Soviet Union and China. They signed the Strategic Arms Limitation, or SALT, and it becomes SALT I because there's a SALT II later on, with the Soviet Union. Nixon travels to China in February 1972. He becomes the first U.S. president to visit the nation. There's even an opera called Nixon in China. Yeah, it's not very good. But anyway, April 1972, Nixon ordered B-52 bombing raids against North Vietnam, including ports. Peace talks continued. Nixon accepted an end to hostilities with northern troops allowed to stay in South Vietnam. On January 27, 1973, a peace treaty was signed. War continues. Saigon collapsed in April 1975. The U.S. had suffered 58,000 deaths and 300,000 had been wounded. The war cost the United States $150 billion. But Nixon will always and forever be known as the man who got us out of Vietnam. You can see the crowd over here, mostly white and male. Hard hats are going to indicate that they are all tough, manly workers. Some are wearing suits and other clothes. They are carrying flags. They're chanting, "Raise the flag." They're expressing their patriotism, their support for the Nixon administration, opposition to the anti-war movement, and support for the Ohio National Guard's actions in Kent State. Which, to be honest, I'm not sure they had any call for that. But anyway, in Kent State, I mean. Alright, Supreme Court's decision in the Brown versus Board of Education triggers a larger judicial revolution. Right-wing activists accuse the Warren Court of legislating from the bench. In the wake of decisions such as Miranda versus Arizona, recognizing arrestees' right to remain silent, so that goes in with the Fifth Amendment, you have the right to remain silent. That's why they're called the Miranda rights, because of this court case. Miller versus California stipulated that contemporary community standards were the rightful measure of obscenity. Many Americans worried about maintaining law and order as crime rates rose in the 1970s. Alright. Courts endorsed strategy of busing to achieve integration in areas where racial segregation in schools remained. 1971, the Supreme Court upheld countrywide busing plan in North Carolina. Oh, not country, county. In the North Supreme Court's decision in Milliken versus Bradley, they ruled that busing plans had to remain within the boundaries of a single school district, making it impossible to achieve racial balance in Detroit and other major northern cities. there are still places in the mid-70s that had not fully integrated. All right, finally, the 1972 election. Democrats are in disarray. They fall into disarray following the loss to Nixon in 1968. Now women, blacks, and younger delegates rule the convention. George McGovern, a liberal senator from South Dakota, is the Democratic campaign. He is a poor campaigner, and he loses to Nixon in every state but Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. So, there is the fact that he was not good. However, you must see how much people like Nixon and appreciate what he did for them. Keep that in mind as we likely move into the next chapter and talk about poor Nixon's demise. So anyway, I hope you have a great morning, afternoon, or evening, and I will see or speak to you soon. Bye.